Okay, I wanted to do a video where we talked just about falchions. And nothing really but falchions in this video, because there's lots and lots and lots of historical misconceptions about this sword from what I found. And it would be really great, wouldn't it, with the internet, if people didn't spout out stuff they didn't really have any idea on at all. But because this is the internet, that obviously happens due to the Dunning-Kruger effect. So what I want to do with this video about falchions is kind of talk a bit about the history that's quite easy to find online of falchions from multiple different sources. And there's a bit of a grey area in some of the bits, but we'll discuss that in the video. And then we'll come up with an idea of what a falchion actually is and what a falchion isn't. So if we start off with the meaning of the word, apparently falchion, from what I could find, is actually French, but it means fake sickle or false sickle. So basically what that word means is that it's a fake sickle, as far as I could tell. So if you think of the sickle as the gardening instrument or the farming instrument, and then you had that as a sword, I can understand why you'd call this a fake sickle. Not this particular falchion, because it's quite straight, but some falchions are fairly curved. And yeah, I can understand actually from the name fake sickle why you might call it that. Now, the falchion was in use from around the 1200s to the late 1500s supposedly, so it was around, you know, for a good 300 odd years, and it was used all across Europe. And because it was used all across Europe for such a long period of time, the designs of lots of falchions differ a lot, but they have lots of similarities. Because I've seen lots of people unfortunately saying this is a falchion or this isn't a falchion, because they're not really looking at what the blades actually, you know, were, and how there was no standardisation of manufacture across Europe. So they'll look at one falchion and say that's not a falchion because X, X, Y, Z reasons or whatever, you know. That's a bit stupid. So obviously if you think that a blade was made all across Europe for 300 odd years by lots and lots of different blacksmiths, often with, you know, massive quality differences, massive design differences, it's no surprise that these blades were often very different, you know, all across Europe. So what would I say a falchion actually is if I'm going to start doing a video where I'm saying, you know, this is what a falchion is and isn't? I would say it's primarily a single-edged sword used for chopping as a priority. Normally they always have single edges. There are some falchions where the, you know, very tip is sharp on this side. It can be straight or it can be curved, it doesn't really matter, but the primary function of a falchion is for chopping, it's for hacking. Often some do have points on, because that's, you know, always better to have a sword with a point in case you want to thrust with it as well. But primarily a falchion's job is to hack, and they were very, very good at that. Now, what you have to do is kind of think where the falchion started off, and basically the origin of the falchion seems to be that lots of peasants needed weapons and they were called up to arms, and they needed something that was a bit like a sword, but obviously it would cost a lot to make a proper sword, like an arming sword or a long sword. You require a lot of training to use it well, which you're not really going to give peasants if you're just calling up for a peasant levy as a defensive purpose. So they needed something that would kind of be useful for them in their daily lives as well. So that's why a lot of falchions don't exist, because they were used just simply as machetes and gardening implements once they had been finished in military use. But as I was saying, the primary job of a falchion should be that it doesn't require much training to use it properly, and these things certainly don't. Now, obviously if you're going to give a peasant a proper sword, they need all the training for it, and don't forget you have a class system in medieval Europe. Peasants aren't allowed to pretend to be noblemen, so they don't have swords. So the early falchions certainly didn't resemble swords very much. They're basically oversized meat cleavers from a lot of, you know, old pictures you can find. If you Google medieval falchion or falchion sword and things like that into Google Images, you'll be able to find lots of different examples of them. In both pictures and reproductions of them and everything else. Just bear in mind with falchions, as said, that you will find some fantasy ones that come up, so don't look at some weird, you know, oversized katana thing and then think that's a falchion if it's from some anime or something like that. But regardless, the whole point of the falchion was it was probably quite cheap to make them, or very cheap to make them by a blacksmith. They were very efficient because they were all about chopping, and obviously if you've used a machete you know just how easy it is to chop with a machete. So consider the falchion, in my opinion, to be a machete sword or a cleaving sword. I think cleaving sword's a lot of names people give to these, and it makes a lot of sense because your primary job of a falchion is to hack with them. Now, as I said, falchions came in all shapes and sizes, and a lot of people online, unfortunately, will start saying, I don't think this is a falchion because it's, you know, like this long, or it's this long, or, you know, it's got a bit of a curve and this one doesn't have a curve, and they try and redefine exactly what falchions are, which is kind of missing the point. It's a very broad term of swords. And there was no standardisation, as I said, and quality control really over making something that looked exactly like something else. So, primarily though, with a falchion, you will have your sharp edge on that side, and then you will have your, on this side, thicker edge. And the idea is it works a bit like an axe, or, you know, a lot of chopping implements, that because you've got the thicker side on this side that's not got an edge and it's heavier, when you chop down, more mass is applied to the sharp side, and it makes horrible, horrible chopping wounds. So the falchion is very easy to use because it's not double-edged. You've just got one edge, you swing that edge against an opponent, the edge comes down on them and it cleaves them. It's very simple, the idea that, you know, you have a one-edged sword with all the weight focused on one edge of the blade. So falchion was good like that. Also, what you'll find with the falchion designs is, because it was used by lots of nations, in each nation it kind of reflects some of the other blades at the time. So what I mean by that is, for example, if you look at the British falchions, or the English falchions, this is what this is, an English falchion, sort of 1500s, 1400s kind of design. This is a War of the Roses style falchion. They're very similar to what would be called hanger swords at the time, tuck swords of the Civil War, that kind of blade design. The seax or seax knife, however it's pronounced, that came before the falchion, which is very popular in England, is kind of like the falchion as a dagger or a small knife. So once you upscale that, it becomes the falchion sword. So it's very easy to understand how English falchions kind of just, you know, fit in with all the other blades used in England at the time. You're not reinventing the wheel, you're basically just making another sword have falchion properties. Or making a sword that's like the swords you have but that has falchion properties. And similarly, if you look at falchion examples from across Europe, the German falchions were messers, because the Germans had the messer sword, which isn't technically a sword, it's a riveted knife, but it's a very big knife, like the Kriegsmesser or the Grossmesser. They're very big swords, or very big knives technically. Peasants weren't allowed swords. How did you get around that if you weren't a nobleman? You had just an oversized knife. It's not technically a sword, because you know, it's riveted, so it's not upsetting the class system, but you've got your pretty much got a sword. And the German Kriegsmessers and Grossmessers were pretty much just falchions, you know, due to the design. They had all the same characteristics, flat edge on one side, curved or straight on the other, but primarily designed for chopping. Some had points, some didn't. Didn't really matter, because the falchion is not defined by its point. So hopefully you're starting to get an idea that the falchion isn't a really uniform design. This is what I want to stress. They all share the same characteristics, that they have a blade on one side, they're primarily designed for hacking at opponents, and, you know, they were very, very good at that. Now, as said, it was a lower class person's sword, but they know from historical stuff that, you know, archaeology and whatever else, that as time goes on, lots of noblemen realise that the falchion's actually a really effective sword. And you start getting the higher quality falchions made like this. You also got falchions with all, you know, the gold stuff on and maybe jewels embedded into it. But the falchion, because it was so easy to use and so horribly effective when it was, you know, put into another person, it didn't take long before actually lots of noblemen realised they'd actually do a better job fighting with a sword like this than they would with an arming sword or a long sword. So, you know, the falchion was brutally effective at what it did, and that was into an opponent, weirdly enough. So, obviously, as I said, falchions can vary a lot, but they do have a lot of similarities, which is that they all are a hacking blade. In a moment we'll look at some machetes, because machetes are kind of like the modern falchions. I did see a good video where a historical reenactor type guy and historian was saying you shouldn't consider falchions to be medieval machetes. You should consider machetes to be modern falchions, which is actually true, because the falchion predates the machete. But this one I had done by Heron Armory is very, very good. It's got the sort of fighting handguard on it, you know, blocks your sword, and if you punch with that, you're going to do a lot of damage to the opponent's head. It's got a sword trap on that side. Again, if your sword comes into contact, slides down there, you can rip it out of somebody's hand or break their wrist with the sword trap. And again, it's got a point for thrusting, and it's got the big hacking edge. and it handles very, very well. You know, very easy to use a falchion. I have absolutely no trainings with swords other than messing about with some swords I've got in my collection. And I can tell you this thing is really easy to handle well enough that you could land lots of, you know, hacking blows on somebody or thrusts. Again, it's the type of blade that's designed for somebody like me, a pleb, to use. And that's the entire purpose of it. I don't need any fancy sword training to be able to pick this up and hack people to death with it. And as I said, the falchions, we don't have many surviving falchions because they're primarily a lower class weapon. If you survive being in combat with your falchion, you came out of your peasant levy, and then you said, I'm going to use this as my farming tool because I can chop down wheat with it or whatever else. So falchions generally didn't survive because they had a practical use. They were used like machetes or, you know, for butchering animals, whatever else, once you came out of military use with them. Okay, so now let's have a look at some machetes, and as said, machetes are kind of modern falchions, a lot of the designs. So this is either what you'd call a bolo machete or a Latin machete. The tip did break off because that was bent. I tried to straighten it out without fully heat treating in it, and it snapped, so at some point I'll grind that down and make a new edge. But machete, obviously, again, it's got only a blade on one side on a typical machete, and it's designed for cleaving actions. So as you can see, it works exactly like a falchion does. This is not really any different than a falchion in terms of combat, you know, capabilities. One thing to note is obviously modern machetes are normally riveted, so they're more like a messer than the falchion. Just going by that, they're not technically a sword, you know, they're a big knife, but other than that, they're pretty much the exact same thing. You would use it the same way as a falchion into your opponent. Oh look, it cleaves them good because it's a cleaving blade. Now, there are various other designs of machetes around, and for example, this machete I always think of as a cutlass machete. I think its technical name is a parang machete. However, what do we notice with it? A single edge, very much like a meat cleaver at the end. You know, a bit of a point if you were to stab, but not a proper point, but you could do serious damage to an opponent swinging this down into them. So again, this is very much like a falchion. The point stands that this is more like one of the curved falchions, but you know, they are pretty much modernisations. The machete is like a modernised falchion. The whole point is it's a cleaving weapon, a chopping weapon, that you can have a point on it as well, but that's the secondary use. The primary is hack, hack, hack. So yeah, both of those machetes bear resemblances to falchions or messers because they're, you know, very similar. So if we just get the falchion back out, you can see that, again, if I just hold this side by side with a machete, they really aren't all that different. And again, as I said, we can't just use this one falchion as an example of what all falchions are, because as I said, some falchions have a much thicker blade than this, a much heavier blade, you know, and they come in all different lengths, but again, both of these are primarily chopping weapons. You could stab with either. Obviously the falchion has a much better point for stabbing, but essentially they work on the exact same principle. The blade is thicker at the edge away from the blade, and it's finished on the actual blade edge, meaning more weight goes down to the blade when you chop. So yeah, machetes are really modernised falchions, or modernised messers, whichever way you want to look at it. But again, the whole point of the falchion, which a lot of people seem to forget, is that it was originally a peasant's weapon. It was for people who didn't have much money for a weapon and who could have had a weapon that's very easy to use because you simply hack with it. If you've ever handled a machete or an axe or anything like that, you can actually move the falchion around very easily. In terms of weight, that apparently from historical records or from what we know, falchions really did vary a lot in weight. This is a very well balanced, you know, well made falchion. However, lots of them were a lot more crude and cleaver-like and were probably, you know, twice the weight of this. But, you know, as I said, you could still probably wield it fairly easily if you had a bit of muscle. The whole point of the falchion is that with raw brute strength, you can swing this into somebody and do a lot of damage. It doesn't need to be, you know, as fancy martial art kind of moves that you'd use with a long sword or an arming sword or anything like that. So there you go. Hopefully I've explained some stuff about falchions. Before I forget, it's generally considered by a lot of historians that falchions became sabres cutlasses, things like that. Basically, that you can look at falchions used in various countries, and you can look at the swords they used after falchions, and you can kind of see the falchionness in them. As I said, you know, with England you had the tuck swords after it, the sea axes before it, and you kind of have the falchion in the middle, and it looks, you know, like a hybrid between the two swords, because primarily that's what it is. Each nation would be very good at, you know, adapting this sword or the falchion design to fit the needs of what they liked in swords. So the English falchions end up being quite elegant compared to most falchions, but still very nice swords. But yeah, the whole point is with a falchion that as long as you've got that chopping edge to it, it can be curved, it can be straight, they can have points or they can't have points, but it has to be a one-sided edge blade for the most part, unless you've got a bit of a secondary blade here. But the primary point of a falchion is cleaving, chopping with it. If it can do that, it's probably a falchion. I know you could then say, but other swords can do that as well, but they wouldn't be, you know, single-edged or anything like that. So anyway, hopefully this hasn't confused you more, this video, and I haven't waffled on as much as I was trying to avoid. But maybe that's cleared up a lot of stuff about falchions. If you want to argue with me about why not, you'll have to provide sources. Don't just start arguing in bad faith, you know, using logical fallacies and saying, well, I once saw a picture of a falchion somewhere, so you're wrong. You know. There you go. All about falchions.